SHAAP is a partnership of the Medical Royal Colleges in Scotland and the Faculty of Public Health, and we're based at the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. I'm also welcoming you here today on behalf of the co-chairs of the Scottish Alcohol Research Network, or SARN, who are Professor Aisha Holloway and Professor Carol Emsley. And SHAAP and SARN are proud to support the Alcohol Occasional seminars, which have been showcasing new and innovative research on alcohol use since they started 8 years ago. These events provide the chance for researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and members of the public to hear about alcohol-related topics and discuss and debate implications for policy and practice. After the event, we will produce a briefing paper aiming to capture the main themes from the event and to communicate these to a wider audience. A video of the event will also be available on our website. So the theme for the seminars this year is alcohol and inequalities. And over the course of our seminars this year, we really have had an excellent turnout and participation in the events, including an increasing international number of delegates, which has been fantastic. So I'd just like to encourage you, wherever you're joining us from today, whether it's from in the UK or further afield, if you'd like, please drop us a message in the chat telling everyone where you're joining us from and your interest in this field of research. I see we're already up to nearly 100 people joining us for the event today, which is absolutely great. And our speakers today, Dr Carly Lightowlers and Lucy Bryant, are going to discuss alcohol-related violence and deprivation, and we're delighted to welcome them today. The burden of social harm from drinking alcohol is substantial. Alcohol is recognised as a contributory factor in a wide range of social problems, including antisocial behaviour, crime, violence, domestic violence, family breakdown, strained relationships, child abuse, and child neglect. There are some fairly shocking statistics on the relationships between alcohol and violence, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that shortly. So let me introduce our speakers. Dr Carly Lightowlers is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Liverpool. Dr Lightowlers' expertise is in the analysis of secondary and administrative and survey data with which to study contentious issues of alcohol, crime and justice. Her work has mainly focused on alcohol-related violence, the relationship between the two, and the processing of such cases through the criminal justice system, as well as the unequal distribution of harm. Lucy Bryant is the Research and Policy Officer for the Institute of Alcohol Studies. She's currently studying for a PhD at the London School of Economics, where she also completed an MSc in Criminal Justice Policy. Her work has covered subjects including alcohol and mental health, drink driving enforcement, and the impact of parental alcohol use on children. So before we hear from Lucy and Carly, I'd just like to cover some more final housekeeping points. For those of you who've been joining throughout my introduction, please note the webinar will be recorded. Please turn off your video if you don't wish to appear in any of our social media or post-event materials. And we'll be covering this event today on social media, on Twitter. So please take a look at the threads on the SHAAP account or use the hashtag Alcohol Occasionals. All participants in the webinar will be automatically muted throughout the presentation, except for our speakers. And please pose any questions or comments related to the presentation you've seen through the chat function on Zoom. And I'll use these to bring individuals to the discussion following the presentations. We'll also laterally move on to a wider Q&A session from the floor. I think, we're up over 100 people joining us, which is fantastic. I always like to see over 100 people here. And I'll now hand over to Lucy, who's going to begin as our first presenter.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Okay, I will just share my screen and hopefully everybody can see my slides. That's great. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to talk us through some work I have been conducting with Carly, looking at alcohol-related violence and antisocial behaviour and inequalities in victimisation by socioeconomic status. So I'm really pleased to be able to start this presentation by sharing that this work has actually been commended by the Office for National Statistics in their annual research awards for our collaboration. And it's been really well received in policy circles as well, which is really encouraging for us, especially, I think, as I talk through these findings, some are quite troubling and quite concerning. So the fact that people have been receptive to this has been really positive. And I'm sure that's something Carly and I will touch on a bit more later. So a finding we see time and again in the alcohol harm literature is one of inequality. So we know the burden of alcohol harm is not felt evenly across society. So whether it's health harm, societal harm, economic harm, these burdens are not felt evenly by all. At the same time, we also know that alcohol is linked to a substantial amount and array of crime. So a significant proportion of all violent offences that take place in the UK do so under the influence of alcohol. So information from the crime survey suggests that if the figure sits somewhere around the 2/5 mark, and there hasn't been much movement on that in the last decade. It definitely hasn't gone down. The alcohol use by perpetrators has been linked to many different types of violence, so murder, assault, sexual violence as well. And finally, when we think about disorder and what we might call antisocial behaviour, when we look at criminal justice records that are associated with this, we see that many of these instances are alcohol related. So there are these really strong links between violence and antisocial behaviour. Now, of course, when we talk about alcohol related violence, that's a very broad category in and of itself. So it covers many sort of subtypes of violence that might have quite different mechanisms, but we're still seeing really strong associations with alcohol. So while we know domestic violence is complex and it has many kind of societal drivers, we also know that alcohol is a contributing factor. And estimates range anywhere from a quarter to 3/4 in terms of the proportions of perpetrators who were drinking at the time of their assaults. Similarly, when we think about stranger violence, data from the British Crime Survey, which is a victimisation survey from a few years ago, shows us that a substantial proportion of all these incidents are alcohol related as well. And of course, the nighttime economy is a setting where we see a lot of stranger violence. And when we look at instances of violence there, we see that these are proportional to the total capacity of alcohol outlets in these spaces. So the associations between these types of violence and alcohol are really clear. Similarly, when we think about antisocial behaviour, as I said, criminal justice records suggest a significant proportion of this is driven by alcohol. And while antisocial behaviour might be more subjective, it might be harder to measure, it's no reason to think it isn't impactful. So Survey work has told us that for some people, experiencing antisocial behaviour affects their sense of safety, and it can drive people away from living in particular spaces. So it's something we should take seriously alongside these other violent incidents. So we were kind of left thinking, well, we know that we're seeing all of these inequalities in alcohol harm. We also know that there are these strong links between alcohol violence and antisocial behaviour. So what's going on in terms of inequalities here? Are we going to see inequalities in the victimisation of these incidents? And what do the socioeconomic kind of profiles look like for victims of alcohol-related violence and ASB? So our starting point, we found there is some research that's kind of looked into this or touched upon it, but the evidence is kind of a mixed bag. So while we have data from, as I mentioned, the British Crime Survey from 2 decades ago that suggests alcohol-related assault is more common amongst people who are unemployed. And we also know from hospital records that alcohol-related facial injuries disproportionately affect young men from socioeconomically deprived areas. We also have some international research using police records that suggests the opposite. So some work in Australia found that there was greater rates of alcohol-related crime, which is a broader category, but in more well-off neighbourhoods. While there is some drawback to using police records in to measure these kind of rates of crime sometimes, we're still left with this kind of mixed picture that we wanted to confirm kind of one way or the other. We also realised that even in the little that had been done, there was no real attempt to disaggregate, like I mentioned, the different subtypes of violence, so particularly domestic violence. And like I said, there's no reason to expect that the mechanism behind alcohol-related stranger violence and alcohol-related domestic violence would be identical, and it might result in very different patterns of victimisation. So we thought that's something really important, that if we want to understand any kind of pattern in victimisation as a whole, we need to get a handle on these subtypes and what's going on at that level as well. And then finally, we obviously also know a great deal about what puts a person at risk of violence in general, but also at risk of alcohol-related violence specifically. So factors about a person such as their age, or behavioural factors like how long they spend in nighttime economy spaces might raise or lower someone's risk. So we thought it important, whatever patterns we saw in socioeconomic victimisation, that we saw whether or not these could be explained by these other known risk factors. So that's what we set out to do. We used data from the Crime Survey for England and Wales, which is a nationally representative victimisation survey, and it asks people just a huge amount of information, not only about incidents of crime of all kinds that they experienced in the last year, but also details about themselves, so kind of demographic information, and also things about such as their kind of experiences with the criminal justice system and things like that. So there's a huge amount of data there. And on the screen is just an example of the kind of variables we used when we were looking at violence specifically. So we used survey items that asked people whether they'd been victims of violence, and if so, what type, domestic, stranger or acquaintance, and whether they suspected the perpetrator to be under the influence of alcohol. We conducted all of our analysis 3 times, each time using a different measure for socioeconomic status, because while there'll be limitations with each measure on their own, if we repeat with each of these measures and we see the same pattern of victimisation every time, we can kind of have a bit more faith in it, that it's not some kind of bug in the data, it's something real that's playing out. And then finally, as I mentioned, we included risk factors that might otherwise predict someone's likelihood of experiencing violence, to see whether these accounted for any SES pattern we saw. So again, biographical information and things about a person's behaviour and their time spent in the nighttime economy. So we did two things. First of all, we calculated incidence and prevalence rates for each type of violence and ASB by a person's SES. So we have incidence rates, which are the number of incidents per 1,000 people, and a prevalence rate, which is the proportion of people who experienced that violence at least once. So it's worth looking at both, because the gap between them can sometimes tell you something about how much repeat victimization is going on, for example. Once we'd done that and we'd established patterns in victimization, we then performed regression analyses to see if those other risk factors I spoke about accounted for any of the patterns we were seeing. So this is quite an intense table of results, but I'm going to take us through it sort of one step at a time. So first of all, we're going to look at alcohol-related violence. So when we look at alcohol-related violence, so any kind of violence, and we use either household income or occupation as a measure of somebody's socioeconomic status, we see that the lowest socioeconomic groups have the highest prevalence rate for this violence. So they're the most victims proportionally in these SES groups. When we look at housing tenure, it's actually private renters that have the highest prevalence rate, but social renters still have a much higher prevalence rate than owners. So we're generally seeing this pattern of victimization kind of clustering in the lowest socioeconomic groups. But what happens when we break things down by violence subtype? So if we look now at alcohol-related domestic and acquaintance violence, we see these patterns much more pronounced. So by any measure of SES, the prevalence rate for alcohol-related domestic violence and acquaintance violence is highest in the lowest socioeconomic group. And when you look at incidence rate, it's highest for 2 of the 3 SES measures we used as well. So the patterns are much clearer here. It's those in the lowest socioeconomic group that are feeling this burden most heavily. When we move to look more closely at some of these disparities, some of these are really quite staggering. So what I've zoomed in on here is the incidence rate, so the number of incidents per 1,000 people for alcohol-related domestic violence when you measure socioeconomic status by housing tenure. So social renters are experiencing 14 times as many incidents of this violence as owners. So these gaps these are big gaps we're talking about sometimes. If we think about stranger violence, the pattern is kind of gone altogether. It's much more mixed. If you measure SES by housing tenure, it looks like private renters are kind of doing worse. But if you measure it by household income, it's those in the highest SES group. So the pattern's kind of disappeared here. And that makes sense when we think about the overall alcohol-related violence pattern that we saw in the beginning. Really, it looks like that's being driven by alcohol-related domestic and acquaintance violence. Those inequalities are so strong there, and they're coming through in alcohol-related violence overall. So now if we think about alcohol-related antisocial behaviour, so the crime survey asks people whether they experienced this in the last year. And as you can see, there's really not much of a pattern here. Experiencing this is kind of spread evenly across all socioeconomic groups. But when we zoom in on these people who did experience it at least once last year, that's when we start to see really kind of staggering patterns. So this is showing when you ask these people who've ever experienced this ASB, how often did you experience this last year? Was it once or was it more often? The lowest socioeconomic groups, more than half of the victims here were experiencing this every week or more. So when you think about those kind of psychological harms that we mentioned at the beginning, sort of damaging feelings of safety and things like that, they become so concerning when you think this is something that's happening to people week on week. And you can see from the graphs, this is the same kind of gradient we were seeing for violence. It's really falling most heavily on those in the lowest socioeconomic groups. So as I mentioned, we have looked at these patterns, trying to account for other risk factors for violence and see what that does. And even when you're controlling for these other risk factors that we know influence a person's risk of experiencing this kind of violence, SES, being in the lowest SES group, still puts you at greater risk of alcohol-related violence and alcohol-related domestic and acquaintance violence particularly. So there is something real going on here. And even when you're accounting for all these other things that might put somebody at risk. We're going to be repeating this same analysis for antisocial behaviour. We've been interrupted by COVID, but that will be coming soon. So I feel this presents kind of two things to think about. First of all, there's a real urgency to reduce this inequality. So as we know, price and availability of alcohol have been consistently linked to levels of alcohol-related violence. And we know that pricing interventions, for example, have been modelled to reduce other alcohol harm inequalities greatly. So when you look at alcohol health harms, something like minimum unit pricing has been modelled to improve health outcomes from those from the lowest SES groups to the greatest degree. And we think that's really promising and something we should be investigating for this violence as well. Secondly, I think it gives us pause to kind of reflect on criminal justice policy and alcohol policy more broadly. These big inequalities sort of suggest something structural is going on, and the policing of alcohol violence has tended to focus on nighttime economy spaces, and that's been kind of the action from government, and that's where energies have kind of been targeted. But as we saw, that's not where these inequalities are. These inequalities are in domestic and acquaintance violence that we might not be able to get at with those kind of policing interventions. And maybe we do need to think about these kind of population-wide measures if we want any kind of meaningful change in those gaps. So you can find this research published in PLOS One, and also a report published through the Institute of Alcohol Studies if you would like to read more. And like I said, we will have more work coming out regarding antisocial behaviour soon. So thank you for listening, and I really look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, so that I hope you found that first presentation interesting. That was clearly an analysis at the individual level about people's victimisation. And what we wanted to do is continue the theme of looking at socioeconomic inequalities in violence as it relates to alcohol. This time I want to speak to you about an area level analysis. So how there might be inequalities in terms of the distribution of alcohol related violence over in different places and spaces. So I'm going to speak to you about the role of deprivation and alcohol availability and how they shape trends in violent crime. This time I'm going to be looking at the police data, the openly available police data. So in this study, we set out to explore whether alcohol availability and deprivation in local areas affected rates of violent crime. And essentially this builds on research that examines whether the availability of alcohol outlets is associated with violent crime. And we sort of add to that mix a consideration of whether deprivation also plays a role here, whether it moderates potentially the impact of alcohol availability. There is, of course, a well-established literature that confirms an association between alcohol availability and violence, and also a well-established literature confirming a correlation between deprivation and violent crime. So we thought that consideration of both these things in tandem was important, as it remains unclear as to what extent these are independently driving trends in violence, or whether, as I said, deprivation modifies the impact of alcohol availability on violence. So in this study, we set out to link three different data sets. The first of which were some novel alcohol availability measures that have been derived from consumer data. The second were openly available police data that capture violent crimes, of course, only those that are recorded and reported to the police. And these include offences such as grievous bodily harm, sexual offences, and the like. I know Lucy mentioned that sometimes the police data isn't often favoured by criminologists, and they prefer the crime survey for England and Wales, but the police data have their own particular advantages. And in this instance, it's the fact that we can capture low-level geographic resolution, and of course some violent crimes come to the attention of the police that can't be captured by a survey, such as homicides, for example. And then our third data set was the index of multiple deprivation, so measure area level deprivation. And essentially, having combined these three data sets, we performed an ecological or area level analysis of the recent trends in violent crime amongst lower super output areas in England for the period between 2011 and 2018. The research questions that we set out to answer were threefold, namely, what is the impact of area level deprivation on violent crime? What is the impact of alcohol availability on violent crime, net of the deprivation effect? And is the impact of alcohol availability moderated by deprivation? So does it perhaps amplify or dampen any effect that we see? And just a brief background in terms of trends in violent crime. This is very much a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot of literature on this in its own right. But there has been a general drop in crime since the 1990s generally, and violence is no exception. The crime survey for England and Wales, for example, show that violence had fallen between 1995 and 2014. But recently, this downward trend has been called into question as police recorded crime figures have roughly doubled between 2013 and 2017, and the crime survey has shown a flattening of that downward trend in violence since 2014 as well. So generally speaking, there's an interest in crime trends and violence therein more generally. But most of the analyses presented around rates of violent crime are done at the national level, and they thus obscure any differences that different areas might see within such trends. And within those kinds of analyses, very few have assessed here in England the variability across local areas conditional upon alcohol availability and deprivation. And so fewer focus essentially on alcohol related violence. And this is surprising in some senses, because we know that the impact of alcohol related harm is not uniform. We also know it is associated with socioeconomic status, and we know that crime is as well. And we also know that there is, a strong association as well between outlet availability, density, and violence. So previous studies that have examined alcohol availability have looked at its impact on alcohol-related harms more generally, so including mainly around health harms such as mortality, morbidity, those sorts of things, and fewer have focused on violence specifically. There are several studies that have done so, and in those that do, we can see that the availability of alcohol and proximity to outlets is known to increase the probability of violent outcomes for a range of different measures. And we also know that it is important to distinguish between the impact of on-licensed premises and off-licensed premises, given that there's varying mechanisms through which these might increase the probability of violence. So we heard, for example, Lucy talked previously about nighttime economy settings, which might be specific contexts in which people congregate together to partake in drinking, and thus there are increased opportunities, for example, to commit alcohol-related violence. We also thought it's very important to consider the role of deprivation, given its strong and established relationship with crime and violence, and how we know that the distribution of crime and violence are not evenly distributed across different areas. We thought it was plausible, given previous insights from other studies, that it was the same for alcohol-related violence, that those from deprived areas might be more likely to experience alcohol-related violence. And we see from other studies that alcohol outlet availability increases the risk of violent outcomes where those premises are located in kind of high-risk environments, and more generally that studies looking at spatial availability of outlet type find that amongst lower socioeconomic groups there's potentially more alcohol consumption in these places. So we also know, and I know you've had another event on the alcohol harm paradox specifically, we also know that generally speaking the distribution of alcohol-related harm is not uniformly experienced by everybody. We see a growing body of evidence that highlights that those of a lower socioeconomic status are more susceptible to and suffer a disproportionate share of the harm despite drinking less or similar amounts. And again, a lot of the scholarship in this space has focused on health harms, as I mentioned before, rather than criminal justice outcomes. So we're hoping to sort of buck that trend and consider how we might see similar patterning among alcohol-related crime. As mentioned before, we combined various data, and here's just a little bit more information for those that want it on those data sources. So over the 7-year study period, we have the violent crimes that are available openly at low spatial disaggregation, and there were sort of 67 million violent crimes that we were able to analyse and append to the lower super output area information on how many crimes there were. We were able to append measures of alcohol availability. As mentioned before, these were derived from consumer data that allowed us to calculate a median travel distance to both on and off licensed premises in the area. And finally, we then also recalculated the index of multiple deprivation, excluding its crime domain, because this is highly correlated with our outcome measure of violent crime, so that we could append as well a measure of what the level of deprivation in each lower super output area in England as well. And having done that, we were able to specify some negative binomial growth curve models to examine changing trends in violent crime across lower super output areas, conditional upon the deprivation profile of that area and the availability of alcohol in that area. And within those models, we also specified an interaction term to look at whether deprivation moderated the effect of alcohol availability. But now on to the interesting bit, the findings. Basically, some headlines are that our findings confirm an upward trend in recorded violence to the police in England between the 2011-2018 study period, and there was substantial variation in the areas studied as to how much violence crime they experienced, and indeed the inequalities that the areas saw, they became more pronounced over the study period. On the whole, recorded violent crime was higher in areas with higher deprivation and also higher in areas with more alcohol availability, especially in the form of unlicensed premises. Deprivation, we found that it played a really key role in driving violence. It was found to be stronger, have a stronger effect on predicting violent crime compared to alcohol availability. And it also important, this is really important, it also amplified the impact of alcohol availability, so in the form of unlicensed premises. So more deprived areas saw a stronger impact of alcohol availability in those areas on violent crime. And that is something that I think, again, is often, we will speak about policy implications in a bit, but often, kind of missing from some of the policy considerations and tools that we have at our disposal to modify or do something about. I will mention that we did also look at an interaction term for off licenses, and this was found not to be significant, but I want to caveat that finding with the fact that our off-license measures only looked at off-licenses and not supermarkets. So it's perhaps potentially misleading to say that there's nothing going on there. If I haven't mentioned it already, that's probably, again, why we see a sort of a stronger impact of unlicensed availability in the forms of pubs, bars and nightclubs driving violent crime compared to off-license availability in our findings as well. So again, some reflections from me on what this might all indicate. Given that we found positive associations between both on and off-license premise availability and violent crime in our findings, this suggests that any attempt to restrict availability to such outlets is potentially an effective way of reducing violent crime as well. Restricting availability can potentially be addressed through planning and licensing decisions and restrictions, which would in turn free up criminal justice agencies and health organisations from some of the burden of alcohol-related violence. But of course, there are several challenges to being able to do this, not least because of the provisions available in the licensing legislation. Secondly, I just wanted to again reflect on that key role that deprivation plays and socioeconomic inequality plays. We do need to think about how we might more effectively respond to this unequal distribution of alcohol-related harm and violence in this instance, because of that disproportionate impact that some areas with high levels of deprivation are seeing. For example, we can potentially consider the density of licensed premises alongside the deprivation profile of an area in making decisions about licensing with a view to ameliorating and preventing violence. And finally, to echo a reflection of Lucy's in her presentation, thinking more generally about the structural drivers of socioeconomic deprivation and how we might more meaningfully intervene so as to reduce the level of harm associated with alcohol-related violence. And these types of interventions are perhaps rarer, and perhaps why we, as I say, see the problems that we see. And I'm really interested to hear from everybody attending today as to what they think might be meaningful ways forward. I know Lucy mentioned minimum unit pricing, cost duty, those sorts of things could be useful here, but I don't think that we have looked at it explicitly in relation to alcohol-related violence as yet. And then finally, I just wanted to end on a note. Clearly, you know, these data are from 2011 to 2018, and the analysis that Lucy and I were talking about before were from the crime survey prior to the pandemic. And the pandemic has shone a new light on health inequalities for sure. And we have seen, you know, inequalities more generally in terms of socioeconomic inequalities widen during this period. We've seen reports of domestic violence increase, and we've seen a massive move and shift to at-home drinking as a result of lockdowns that have been imposed upon us. And as we've seen, some of our nighttime economies and our unlicensed premises closed completely. So we are keen to think about future research to examine these inequalities and how they look during and post the pandemic. And we're exploring that currently. And this would be a really interesting time to perhaps more, well, it presents a unique opportunity for us to examine, for example, during periods of nighttime economy closure, the effect of at-home drinking on violence without the noise of the nighttime economy impact thereon. So it's an interesting time to pursue some of these other research agendas around what impact is at-home drinking having on violence if we take away consideration of the nighttime economy. That's a whistle-stop tour of research that is yet to be published. It's in progress. But I would open up, I suppose, at this stage to Lindsay to chair questions, thoughts, comments on either presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Carly and Lucy, for presenting today. I think those were both really interesting presentations from kind of two different perspectives. And I mean, I know some of the stats in them kind of shouldn't be surprising, but they never fail to surprise me. And really just, it's so stark how inequalities do impact on these sorts of issues. And I think as we move into the questions, I've been struck actually from well, first of all, thank you very much to everybody who's been contributing to the chat to say you know, where they're joining us from and the kind of background they have and their interest in this research, because it's it's really hugely varied. People's, you know, the where people are coming to this event from, and I think it's really valuable actually to have such different and diverse backgrounds of people attending today. I mean, I suppose one of the things Carly, in your presentation that I saw about, you know, kind of on-license and unlicensed premises rather than kind of off-licenses, and that kind of fueling levels of violence, I think I found quite interesting. And I think I don't know if anyone who's attending today has begun to do any research kind of in that area as to how the impact of lockdown has kind of changed the levels of violence happening since unlicensed premises are closed. Has anyone been looking at that? Well, if anyone has, please let us know. I mean, both Carly and Lucy, what were the, I suppose, did anything actually surprise you from the, you know, the findings? Did you find anything kind of most shocking?
I think, if I'll go first, if that's okay. I think again, we were looking at alcohol-related violence in general in the first presentation that Lucy gave us, and I think we were quite surprised to see how much domestic violence was driving these disparities. I think we were both taken aback by that. I think it's quite interesting though, because what we've seen is, since subsequently we have had a very, we have had quite a lot of interest in those findings, and we wouldn't have perhaps initially thought that they would have had influence and potential mention in, for example, the domestic abuse bill the proceedings around that, but they have been, and they've been very, I think everybody's been quite surprised by those findings. I don't know if you'd agree, Lucy.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, I think we went in expecting to see inequalities because of the kind of background of the harm literature and of the violence literature separately. But yeah, when seeing how much that was driven by domestic violence was really quite staggering. And we use data that lines up with government estimates of those crime types, and we know that actually that represents an underestimate in kind of the level. So even though we are confident in the patterns, the levels we're reporting are probably low, which just made it even more troubling to find, really. Yeah.
And I suppose just bouncing off that, I thought it was, whilst we were having these conversations, I think it became more apparent to me anyway, and maybe I should have been more aware before, about just how siloed some of the conversations are that are going on around policy, if, for example, in response to domestic violence, and the unfortunate increase that has been experienced during the pandemic period, and how there was widespread uproar about this, and a will to do something about it. Absolutely, that's not to say that in any way is wrong. And then there was a lot of noise, for example, around the nighttime economy closures and the impact that was having on the economy. But there was very little dialogue across those two things. So, for example, the role that increased stress, being locked at home, your job losses, and drinking might be having on the domestic violence. The alcohol availability, widespread cheap availability in supermarkets, and its contribution to the domestic violence was never really very explicitly linked or made, and we think that's a kind of missed opportunity, really.
Thanks very much. I'll move on to Elena Smith, who's got her hand up.
Hi, thanks both. Great presentations, and certainly have given me lots of food for thought. I am involved in a research project that Niamh Fitzgerald is leading, and we are looking at the impact of late hours opening on alcohol harms, which primarily was looking at ambulance data, but we are trying to get police data. That project obviously has been a bit not derailed, but we're refocusing because COVID has impacted greatly on it. We were due to start in October last year, right in the middle of lockdown, so we are changing our focus. So we will be looking at that. But my day job is as a health improvement lead for alcohol licensing, covering Glasgow City, and your findings have really made me think very differently about how we need to start the conversation in relation to aligning the legislation that currently covers our alcohol licensing. It currently looks at violence in relation to 500 metres within the premises, and in terms of availability, I just had a licensing agent saying to me there is no causal link being established in the availability of alcohol, therefore you can't actually say that it's detrimental to public health at a licensing board, and licenses were granted on Friday for two areas which are really badly impacted. So I am really keen to find how best we can reshape this conversation. But the one striking thing that I wanted to ask about was why you left out supermarkets. When it comes to off sales, we're actually finding a lot of very different premises types coming in now to be able to offer off sales alcohol. So the increasing number of convenience stores attached to petrol stations, as well as supermarkets of varying different types. And COVID has also seen an increase in the number of convenience store applications coming through as well. So we have had a bit of a hit, but also the availability of home delivery of alcohol as well. So I was wondering what your thoughts were in terms of being able to look at these different mechanisms and their impact within your findings.
Thank you, such interesting observations there. Just wanted to mention, it's not that I deliberately excluded supermarkets, it's that the measure there wasn't a measure that I could include. So it was more of a warning label to say I have found these patterns, but I suspect that there's obviously more complexity going on exactly of the nature that you describe, that actually, as we saw with the work Lucy spoke on, that actually, you know, there could be a big impact going on about at-home drinking rather than the nighttime economy focus, which has been, again, a very traditional kind of way of dealing with violence, you know, this criminal justice approach that we police the nighttime economy, but actually, you know, it's potentially misguided as well, for the very reasons that you say. And I'm very interested to hear and maybe pick your brains further about the way in which the licensing policy as it currently stands is limited in being able to consider some of these very important contextual factors around particular areas, around like their levels of deprivation, the other, you know, other attributes that we might need to think about to gain a more kind of well-rounded picture as to whether really introducing another licensed premises is really the best way forward. As you say, there's limited scope to kind of actually push back on it, and with the violence, as you say, that parameter of that 500 meters, I think you said it was, you know, it's very difficult to actually evidence at that level. But, you know, reframing the debate around reducing health inequalities might be a way of changing that somehow over the long term, I'm sure. I don't know if Lucy has any reflection.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so surprising to hear you say people are pushing back even on the evidence of the link between availability and violence. That's so disheartening. But I think it just speaks to how, like, anytime researchers can raise that with policymakers, it's, you know, the more times we share it, the more times it might stick. I don't know. But I think the thing you're speaking about how needing to attribute to kind of individual premises in this really narrow sort of geographical space you can consider is so, I think that just ties up with how alcohol is policed in more generally, because it is so individual. It's about individual people, individual premises, and really it zooms in so tightly that you can't zoom out and see any context, and I think that's just another symptom of that. But yeah, I'm so glad that you found this useful, and I'm happy to send anything else you'd be interested in.
Thank you. Yeah, just to say, whenever it comes to actual licensing board decisions, the police tend to not really put a huge amount forward in terms of their statistics, which is quite harrowing because we don't routinely have access to their statistics. So being able to use violence, general statistics in terms of what's going on within a community, they're the ones that have to put that forward. But I think certainly from what you guys have presented today, I will be looking at taking a more public health approach to how we present the crime statistics, and hopefully have our police colleagues on board with that.
Thanks very much, Elena, for bringing in that topic to the discussion. And I think, you know, the issue of licensing is something that is very important in this area. And I mean, I know in Scotland, you know, there still is, despite there being legislation in terms of, you know, licensing boards seeking input from, you know, the health board and police and so on, it still is, or it seems to be very difficult to actually, you know, see any kind of positive outcomes from a public health perspective from the licensing board decisions all too frequently. I mean, in terms of the the kind of the density discussion, and this is maybe more on the kind of off licenses, but certainly, I mean, I still remember first hearing from Niamh Short about you know, the issues around outlet density, and the work she had done on that was really fascinating, and I think that's you know, that really kind of grabbed my attention, and obviously there still is much more on that we need to do. So I'd like to bring in Diane Gosler just now, who has a question. Diane, are you? Here we are. Oh, you're on mute, Diane. Oh, still on mute. Oh, okay, I'll move on, Diane, and come back to you. So one thing that...
I'm fine now.
Oh, you're okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking at the wrong image. Yeah, Lindsay, you mentioned Scotland. This isn't my question, but I just did mention on the chat that it would be very interesting to see what part MUP plays. Scotland has MUP, England doesn't. You know, sort of what is the difference there about violence and alcohol? My question was to Lucy. She mentioned disability as being one of the factors that was taken into consideration. And I wondered if that was split between physical disability and, say, mental disability, such as learning difficulties. And if that wasn't split, you know, what would it show? Were the two to be split? Because I think, you know, probably quite different results.
Yeah.
So that was my question. And also just a quick comment, it will be very interesting to see when lockdown entirely goes away, what effect it has on home drinking, if people will be used to home drinking. If there's a lot less home drinking, then how will the violence decrease? So anyway, my question was about disability.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diane. I think so. We included disability as another risk factor, because we'd read other research that suggested that could increase a person's risk of experiencing violence. So we wanted to put that in there. In the crime survey that we used, as I understand it, and I will double check for you, and if I'm wrong, I'll send you an email and let you know. But as I understand it, that did include physical and mental disability. It was a self-defined measure, so people were sort of, I think they had a sort of a range of they could either sort of select something, or they could write, they could, you know, choose sort of other and write something in to describe their own experiences. So the measure we used was ended up as a yes no. That's how it is presented once it gets through to the researchers. That's what you get published. So I can't say anything about that split between physical and mental disability, and you're right, that would be so interesting to look at further. One thing I didn't mention in the presentation, but we were surprised at just how, I think Carly will echo this, like just how much of a contribution having a disability had to a person's risk of experiencing these kinds of violence, and particularly the alcohol-related domestic violence as well. Obviously, that wasn't kind of the main focus of what we were doing, but we did see that, and we thought that's quite something as well. And in our paper, we kind of pointed to other researchers who could take that forward, because that's certainly something that needs more investigation, I think.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks.
I'll just come to a question that was in the chat, actually, which is regarding gender-based violence. And it was from Moira Plant, who's one of our SHAAP steering committee members. And she's asking, Carly, did you see a trend in women as instigators of violence? And if there was any kind of relation to COVID in there.
Well, that's definitely a very interesting area, and in much of my previous work, I've looked at, you know, violent perpetrators rather than perhaps victimization, as in Lucy's presentation. Unfortunately, the data that I was accessing doesn't have that level of detail in at all. And the survey that we used for the other study which Lucy presented is a victimisation survey rather than a perpetration survey. In England and Wales we did have a very good survey at one stage that looked at involvement in crime, perpetration of crime, and including violence, which would have potentially facilitated that, but that was decommissioned several years ago now and no longer exists. But actually in Scotland you might have some better data in that regard, I believe. So we haven't been able to look at that, but that is interesting. And I have, heard some anecdotal things about more women being arrested and things like that. But I don't know much about why. But I think you're right. I think it's an interesting area. I don't know if Lucy, you've got any reflections.
No, sorry.
Thank you very much. I'll go to a question actually which has an international context from Peter Rice, who's former chair of our SHAAP steering group. And I know on today's at today's meeting we've got quite a few different people from across the world actually. I've seen in the chat people saying they're from Russia, Nepal, Cyprus and Uzbekistan, which has been fantastic. I hope I haven't missed anyone out who's been commenting in the chat there. And Peter's asking about international evidence about the extent to which inequalities in a country is related to inequalities in violence. Is that something that, I mean, not particularly for Carly or Lucy, unless you want to, but also more widely, is that something people here today are have some knowledge of? Feel free to put your hand up if you'd like to contribute.
I don't know exactly, Peter, but I think I have heard people kind of put forward similar theories. I don't know if anything rings a bell to Carly, but I mean, it's really difficult making cross-country comparisons because different kind of measures of inequality and measures of violence, you think they're quite simple concepts, but they can be measured many different ways, and that does make international comparison quite difficult. But I have heard things about inequality and violence kind of feeding each other. I don't know, Carly, do you agree?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think about, is it Wilkinson and Pickett probably have some stuff in their book, The Spirit Level, and again, for the reasons that Lucy says, it's very hard to look at kind of maybe domestic violence and stuff like that because of the rate at which that's reported and the way in which that's captured in different, different kind of legislation and crime types. I imagine that there should be some evidence out there, like maybe I should know about, that relates to homicide, because that might be more uniformly captured. But when it starts to get to the sort of other more, in inverted commas, trivial crime types, then it becomes difficult because they'll all be defined and measured differently. But there is an international crime and victimisation survey, so maybe Lucy and I could do some hunting there as well.
Now, I'm actually going to come to a question from Mike Ward, who's joined us from Alcohol Change UK. Mike, are you here still on the call? Can you unmute, and if you are, maybe he's not, but Mike could ask a question about head injuries and kind of patterns of head injury in terms of correlation with violence and alcohol use, and also linking in then to deprivation, and lower economic groups have higher rates of head injuries, and just how this all fits in. I don't know, I know we do have quite a few kind of clinicians on this Zoom as well, so if anyone would like to contribute to this, please do so. Put your hand up. Is there anything that we can contribute to this discussion about head injuries?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose that would have been the missing third presentation, because when we look at violence, measuring violence, often there are sort of three data sets that are used to sort of triangulate patterns, and one is the crime survey, for which we heard. The other is police data, and the third is, of course, health data in A&E attendances and the like. And I imagine that, again, we see similar patterns in those data, whether that be facial injuries or head injuries. Clearly, Lucy and I haven't looked at those today, but those are the sort of the trio of data sets that usually are used to look at patterns in violence. Yeah.
We'll definitely want to think of going forward as well. And I'll come to David Barber, and I can see David on screen. David, I know I mentioned previously about kind of gender, a kind of gender-based question, and you're thinking about it from another kind of protected characteristic in terms of the LGBTQI community. Is there something you'd like to pose to Carly and Lucy?
I was more just kind of sort of wondering how the stuff is impacting on violence, domestic violence in the LGBTQI community. I've been aware of recent research, couple of events I was at, on how LGBT people are more, or QI people are more likely to appear in the criminal justice system because they're sort of slightly more likely to transgress social norms, or a lot of the time because they feel that government or sort of society has wronged them or harmed them, so they have less respect for social kind of government institutions and things like that, or rules, if you want to call it that. And then also we're at more risk of violence generally as a population anyway, and obviously more risk of using alcohol harmfully. So yeah, I was just wondering or pondering how that might be impacting on our community, and wondering if there was any thoughts you had on that, maybe.
I'm going to divert to Lucy on the sort of technical aspect of that, as to whether or not the crime survey has a specific measure that allows us to identify someone in that regard. I know that even for the breakdown that we did, including disability and sex, we had to pull 5 years worth of the survey together to get enough statistical power to look at the disaggregation of violence within subgroups, because fortunately violence is relatively rare, and we just needed that the decent amount of cases to be able to do that breakdown. So maybe Lucy, you have an insight there.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was thinking. It's because of the fact that we were already cutting violence into alcohol related and non-alcohol related, and then again by these subtypes, and then again by SES. As soon as you start controlling for extra things, you've got kind of limited capacity to add more in. But you're right, there are just so many dimensions to this question that I think once we found these inequalities, it just made all of these other kind of angles so much more pressing, and because we were never expecting to find such big gaps where we did. I think that would be a really interesting way to look at it. Whether the crime survey is the right tool because of that kind of because of that sample size problem, might not be the thing to use, but I think it would be really valuable to ask those questions, definitely.
I think there was another thing actually I'd seen recently as well, if I'm just remembering it. I can't remember exactly what it was, that surprised me a little bit, just because there is this stereotype of LGBTQI people being more wealthy because they don't have kids, but actually there was quite a substantial amount of the population live in social housing or in areas of deprivation, and so this myth that of the pink pound is not quite as accurate. So it would be interesting for that as well.
Yeah, I think what this research has shone a light on, and many other studies of course as well, is like, again, we've just sort of like taken socioeconomic status as one indicator and seen such stark comparison, but then what we haven't been able to do is look at those multiple intersecting aspects of disadvantage and how they might be influencing people's experience of alcohol-related harm and violence. How gender interacts with class, interacts with sexuality, and all disability, and all those things to sort of further compound some of these issues.
Thanks very much. I'm just looking in the chat, and I see Wayne Galt has posed a couple of questions. Wayne, I see you're on screen with us. Is there anything you'd like to kind of pick out particularly to kind of pose to Carly and Lucy, or indeed the rest of us here today?
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Lindsay. You can see the questions I've posed there, but I'll make them a bit more generic as one question. And it's really, and this is not supposed to be an overtly challenging question, but I wonder if there's, from a sociological or even more existential perspective, any reason that the impact of alcohol harm studies on social policy, government policy, seems to be so slight.
I think there are a couple of things going on. Obviously, when we're talking about something like alcohol-related violence, there are a lot of fields crossing over one another and a lot of interests. We're working with, criminal justice policy, we're thinking about health policy, we're thinking about, as Carly mentioned, the interest of kind of businesses and licensing, and that always makes a policy area kind of more fraught and more complex. I think not to get too abstract, but there are things that might be equivalent problems in terms of the harm or the burden they pose to a group of people might be conceptualized quite differently by governments, and they might come with kind of ideological baggage maybe that makes action harder on one thing versus another. I don't know what you think, Carly. I think we've been thinking about this a lot in terms of what the criminal justice response to alcohol-related violence looks like, and even just within that area of policy, why that can be so disjointed and so sort of two hands moving in two different directions, I guess.
Yeah, not least because alcohol in violent crime policy at the moment doesn't really feature much, for example. It's all kind of very much, around violence against women and girls, modern slavery, all of the gun and knife crime amongst young people, despite the fact that actually maybe the bulk of the crime is middle-aged men beating up their wives at home, that kind of, so it's very much, it's movable, and it's movable as Lucy said, it's two different kind of tracks as well. Public health, and we've seen alcohol-related violence sit in both. We've seen it being very squarely allocated to crime, to Home Office agendas, and now it sort of sits a little bit more in public health agendas amongst this wider concept of health harms. So it is very difficult to kind of pin down. And as I said, I mentioned when I was reflecting on, the debates we've been having just during the pandemic around the violence happening to women, children, people in the home, and the debates that are going on around alcohol availability, but they're framed in such different ways. Yeah, I think it's up to the people to sort of challenge that, I suppose, based on lived experience and maybe our research as well.
I'm just going to come in. Barry Sheridan, I think you're still on the call. Are you able to unmute and?
Sorry. Thanks, Lindsay. I said that for myself, kind of a researcher hat as well as a policy professional, and I suppose this term lived experience. I just think that the main question is, how do you think researchers can work better to understand experiences of people from lower socio-economic backgrounds? For myself, the whole telling stories of people with lived experience, it wouldn't actually be acceptable in any other policy area other than lower in terms of policy areas dealing with socio-economic inequalities. So how do we actually make sure that the research is better and we can actually engage with people with these backgrounds? Because I think there's a class disparity, and how do we actually engage people we need to engage in terms of tackling inequalities.
Yeah. I can offer some personal thoughts on the matter. Clearly, the kind of research that Lucy and I have done is very sort of high level population studies that can't speak to the lived experience particularly. What it has by way of benefit is that it obviously, for example, in the analysis we say it's indicative of a whole nation's worth of data, and Lucy's is obviously again representative of the general population, but of course that's never really the same as hearing people's personal stories and journeys. Sometimes I think that, again, the alcohol field seems a bit better in this, and inviting people in to share with their lived experience, their lived stories, and having people represented on different boards and steering groups in that regard. But you're right that actually engaging with people from the deprived communities themselves is relatively absent. And I think that that's not necessarily something that researchers deliberately goes down. I mean, there's a lot of great ethnographic work. There's a lot of really great, in-depth qualitative work with individuals. But that I think again, it's the appetite from the policy perspective that again, some of this broader level kind of research that is framed in kind of the ways that the numbers that they already know. They know the crime survey, so we can present their data back to them and we can kind of speak their language and they can understand our findings. I'm a quantitative researcher, so unfortunately I have little to bring to the table in that regard, but there are certainly some excellent qualitative researchers out there that could bring that. But I've often found that, again, MPs and the like, they really like stories, because again, they kind of it's less personal, the sort of data that we present here today, and that actually they need to bring it alive with those personal stories. So I also
find it very undignified that people from socio-economic background are having to share their stories. It wouldn't be the case if they're from middle class background or any other aspect. So if we're serious about tackling inequalities, give people their dignity, and they don't have to share their stories, because the alcohol harms are disproportionate in areas of deprivation. And if we're at a Scottish level, if we're actually having to go down the route of co-production and involving people, we need to make sure it's meaningful, dignified, rather than saying, come along, roll you out and tell your story.
Yeah,
I'm ready.
Oh, sorry.
I think that's. Oh, sorry, Lucy. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say I agree, and I think what you're talking about co-production and like respect and kind of thinking about the kind of like the toll it can take on someone to engage in research in that way can be quite heavy. And so I think you're right. I think that's if there are areas where lived experience is valuable, then we need to like think about it in those terms and think really carefully what people are giving when they're sharing those kind of reflections. And yeah, I agree with Carly. I think maybe it's thinking about how we can bring things together. So when we have the kind of work that Carly and I have done, where we've identified big patterns, that we have noticed that policymakers, they just are slightly comforted by seeing crime survey because they're used to it. Like that definitely is that is a useful in. And then so yeah, I think you're right, Barry, like thinking really carefully, not using people and just kind of being respectful with how those voices are kind of like included and things like that. I completely agree.
Thank you, Barry. That's a really important and interesting point to kind of unravel there in the discussion. Thank you. So we're now actually nearing the end of our time at today's event. If there is a final pressing question from anyone, we have probably time for one more question, but otherwise we'll be wrapping up. Please. No, none appearing in the chat. So yes, I was going to say, please speak now or forever hold your peace. So I think we've had a very good discussion today, and I think covered a huge range of different topics. And Carly and Lucy, you gave really, really interesting presentations. Thank you. With a lot of information that I think, you know, it just shows how much there is more to do, and all the different aspects. Whether, you know, we're looking at kind of licensing and outlet density, and then no doubt in kind of the months and years to come, there'll be more research in terms of how the pandemic and lockdown have affected these kind of violence related stats. And I mean, it's just really just shows how important that researchers and policymakers continue to focus on the inequalities theme, because you know, the reasons why are kind of in bold in the stats, unfortunately, on the screen, and this is why we need to continue what we're doing. So I'll just wrapping up, I'll just let you know that our next event is going to be on the 28th of April, and we're going to be discussing understanding drinking transitions during lockdown, social inequalities, alcohol and the COVID pandemic, delivered by Dr. Emily Nichols from the University of Portsmouth. So if you'd like to join us then, or indeed at our, we've got 2 more events then coming in June, please take a look at the SHAAP website, and you can sign up there to join us at those forthcoming events. And finally, I'd just like to thank again Carly and Lucy. Thank you very much for bringing your work to us today and for sharing it. Thank you. I think everyone's found it really, you know, fascinating, and I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us in our virtual audience, from wherever you are in Scotland, the rest of the UK, or overseas. It's been great to have you with us. And we hope to see you again soon at one of our future events. So thank you very much again, and take care everyone, and goodbye.